another week, another new deal.
Yeah, I think this Palantir partnership is definitely helping to boost the stock.
And that would be something that I would think you're going to see again in this quarter.
Palantir making more headlines once again, just 2 weeks ahead of its earnings report.
And I've noticed that that's been a pattern with Palantir going back several earnings reports.
MarketBeat's Chris Markoch shares what Palantir investors should be ready for heading into earnings.
I think that's going to be significantly higher than the 180 you're seeing today.
He'll also cover what long-term Palantir investors could expect for gains next year. Let's dive in. Chris, so great to have you back on the show talking about one of your favorites, Palantir. We're just a couple of weeks away from earnings, and I know there's a really interesting pattern that you have for retail investors to keep in mind leading into Palantir earnings. But before we get right into that pattern, let's talk about some other headlines that Palantir has made this week, and that's a new partnership, a new deal that's really getting some press this week.
With Palantir, it's another week, another new deal that's being announced. This one was announced on the commercial side. I wrote about this for MarketBeat, and the deal is with a company called OneMedNet Corp. They're a publicly traded company. So what's happening there is OneMedNet's going to be using Palantir's AIP platform to enhance its healthcare and data analytics capabilities. This is a win for Palantir, but it also plays off of earlier wins that Palantir had working with the FDA and the NIH on the government side, and now they're bringing that. This is another example, I should say, of how Palantir is bringing that over to the commercial side of the business.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the commercial side of Palantir growing just as much as that government side and how that's a really important factor to look at for investors. Let's talk about the healthcare aspect of this. Does Palantir have other healthcare deals? Is this kind of a big move for the company into the healthcare sector more than some of the other sectors it might already be in?
They do have other contracts in the healthcare system. They've got some contracts with some pharmaceutical companies. So this isn't new to them in that sense. But I think where this is really exciting is because Palantir in this case is going to be accelerating OneMedNet's use of real-world imaging data into clinical research. And this is going to get into areas like oncology and cardiology and rare diseases. And so these are all examples of things where when you think about the promise of artificial intelligence and what it can do, these are exciting areas for investors to think about, because this is where if we can speed up that timeline without sacrificing that quality, without sacrificing that rigor, that's where the exciting opportunities can come in to accelerate the possibility of getting treatments into market.
Yeah, that's just another exciting sign that Palantir is making the progress and making the deals that are going to hopefully show up on the earnings report. And we will, of course, have all of that earnings data broken down on marketbeat.com as soon as that report drops next month. But if you're looking for even more data on Palantir, make sure to sign up for our free 1-month trial of our advanced AI tools for an even deeper dive into many investing statistics on MarketBeat. You can scan the QR code now or click the link right in the description to start your free trial today. All right, Chris, I'm excited to talk about all of the earnings implications for Palantir and some of these patterns that you're picking up on. But before we get to that, I do want to talk a little bit more, just briefly, about this healthcare company they're partnering with. It's a small company, but the chart is really interesting simply because they've seen so much growth recently.
The company is a tiny company. It doesn't generate a whole lot of revenue. It's still unprofitable, yet it's choosing Palantir. And that's, I think, the real takeaway for investors here is OneMedNet's recognizing the strength of Palantir, and they're trying to apply that to their own business model, which I think is an interesting way to approach this going forward. Is the stock's up 85% year to date. The company's obviously hitting on something, and they're seeing an advantage that they believe Palantir could help them achieve.
Yeah, I think this Palantir partnership is definitely helping to boost the stock. You can see a nice little jump right after that announcement was made earlier this week. So an interesting company to look at, another interesting partnership that's just one of many new contracts for Palantir. That's really the focus. I wanted to just look at this other stock chart quick, but Palantir is the focus right now, and it is, again, just a couple of weeks away from earnings season. What are we expecting or hoping to hear from Palantir this earnings?
Well, obviously, investors are expecting and hoping to hear that Palantir is going to have another awesome quarter, that they're going to crush it again, that you're going to see an obscene Rule of 40 score, and all of the things that investors have been known to see. But what I think you've been seeing here in the last month or so in terms of the Palantir stock prices, it's been fairly choppy. It's kind of consolidating in a range. You've seen some days where the stock moves down a little bit, and then it might pick up a little bit, but it's trading in a fairly defined range. And I've noticed that that's been a pattern with Palantir going back several earnings reports. It tends to chop around a little bit, consolidate would be the better term, heading into the earnings report. And then the earnings is usually what has broken it. Quite frankly, it breaks it to the upside. Now, there's always the possibility that if Palantir just meets expectations or comes in below expectations, it could cause the stock to drop. We just haven't seen that yet. Doesn't mean it can't happen. It's just that Palantir's trend has been to beat earnings, and not only beat them, but beat them by a fairly impressive margin that stirs more interest in the stock.
Yeah, I think that's what the stock is waiting for right now, is a little bit more interest to pop up, because it hasn't done much of anything over the last month or two. Let's just look at that chart action, because we haven't talked about Palantir on the channel for a while.
Right. It's finding resistance. So right after the company's last earnings report, it got up there around 188, and that has served as a point of resistance. If investors can look at the chart, at least two occasions just within the last month, the stock's knocked right up to that 188 point, and then it comes back down. So that's telling investors that right now that's a pretty critical point of resistance that the stock's looking to move past. And the next catalyst for that movement is probably likely to be earnings. If the company delivers an earnings report that investors have become used to, then I think you could easily see Palantir blow past that point. And then we're talking about that $200 price level, and even some analysts have been going above that $200 price level. And I think you could see Palantir getting there, especially if that's supported by a broad market rally towards the end of the year.
Yeah, I think that the analyst predictions are important to talk about, because we had a brand new one this week that is leading the stock even higher.
Yeah, Piper Sandler. They came in, this would be Tuesday of this week, and they raised their price target. They've kept the overweight rating on Palantir, but they boosted their price target from 182 all the way to 201. That's still below Bank of America, which is coming in at 215, and they raised it on September 23rd. They raised it from 180 to 215. Of course, we know that Dan Ives of Wedbush, he was the first one to come out there with the $200 price target. And other analysts are just, again, they continue to raise the price targets on the stock. You and I have talked about this in the channel before. Palantir has become a stock where I'm really not that wowed by where people are saying the ceiling could go, because I believe the ceiling for Palantir could be much higher than what it is now. But I think in terms of the risk for investors, you got to look at where the floor is. And right now, analysts, that consensus price target for MarketBeat has already gone up to 141, which for some investors, they may look at that and say, well, that's potentially 20% downside. Yes, but look at where that price target was 6 months ago. Look at where that price target was a year ago. And so you see institutional money is flooding into Palantir, and along with it, the price targets for it are going up. So I'm not saying institutions are necessarily throwing in the towel, but I'm saying they're realizing that the stock is probably not going to be going back down into the 80s and 60s like some people had thought it was going to.
Yeah, there's been such a story for Palantir over the last year or almost 2 years, where it just exploded far beyond expectations. I'm wondering if maybe some of the reason we're not seeing a ton of price action right now, or maybe even as many headlines, is there any more of that explosive growth still ahead for Palantir, or has that explosive growth phase already passed? Not to say that the stock is going to drop back like you just said, but are we going to see the same kind of shocking growth that we've seen for this stock in the future?
Well, I think that is the general sense. Short interest on Palantir remains, it remains fairly elevated. It's down from its highs, but it's the percentage of the float isn't that high. It's only about 2% of the float, but it's gone up in the last month. It's up about 10%, and that's probably pretty natural with the stock hitting that all-time high, and you've been seeing the stock is having trouble getting past that. I think that's probably a little bit of the short interest, and that's the reason why. Analysts are kind of looking at it and saying, back in the day, there used to be the bet of, well, if Tiger Woods was playing in a major tournament, do you pick Tiger Woods or do you pick the field? And I think really that's kind of what's happening with Palantir going into earnings. Are you expecting Palantir to have another blowout quarter, or are you expecting something maybe a little bit more normal? And that's, I think, some of these investors are saying, but the percentages would indicate Palantir might come in with a quarter that's more normal, and if it does, the stock could drop, could drop some based on the fact that they didn't deliver that blowout number that people were looking for.
Yeah, we've often talked about Palantir as being priced to perfection, right? That the PE ratio is so out of whack on this one that it really has to deliver to make sense of the stock price right now. Is that very much still the case for this stock?
I think so. And again, I think when, I think sometimes we have to be careful. I've been bullish on Palantir. I'm not going to change that sentiment now. I think price to perfection can sometimes be thrown around as a pejorative term for investors. If you're invested in Palantir for the long haul, you're not really caring that much about what happens quarter to quarter, 3 months to 3 months, 6 months. I mean, that's more of the focus of institutional investors who have to make their numbers. If you're a long-term investor, you're trying to consider, where do you believe Palantir is going to be in 5 years? And, I think that's going to be significantly higher than the 180 you're seeing today. The question you have to ask as an investor, if you're a momentum trader, it's a different question. And that's where I think you're seeing some choppiness. Is some investors are trying to think, when is the right time to try to get in on Palantir? And I think they're hoping for something, for that stock price to go a little bit lower than it is right now so that they can get a better entry, hoping for a pop after earnings.
Yeah, I think everyone's just been waiting for the stock to
Right.
pull back, and it's not doing much of that right now.
No.
Let's talk about the earnings pattern that you've seen for Palantir, that we've seen quarter after quarter for this company, and what retail investors can expect leading into earnings these next couple of weeks.
Barring any news that obviously we don't foresee coming, I think you're going to see Palantir trade in this range. I think you're going to probably see it try to go up near that record high, and it's probably going to come down a little bit. It's just going to chop around there because it's looking for a direction that doesn't exist right now. Certainly, some people could point to the peace deal that's in place in the Middle East, and that could actually be bearish for Palantir, because that means that perhaps some of the capabilities that it has been using with Israel are not going to be used as much. People are looking at the Russia-Ukraine situation and saying, if there's a resolution there, that would be bearish to Palantir. But none of that's going to be really known within the next couple of weeks. So I expect the stock to chop around a little bit. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we saw that back in July, right before it reported earnings in August. And we saw that right before it reported in May. And that was even a little bit crazy because that was around the whole tariff situation. But you see this situation where a lot of investors are just kind of like in wait and see mode before Palantir reports, and they're looking for that confirmation of a strong report, which Palantir has consistently delivered. And again, that doesn't mean it's always going to deliver that, but the pattern has been that they've delivered that, and that would be something that I would think you're going to see again in this quarter.
A good look ahead, Chris, at what investors can expect leading up to earnings just a few weeks away. Of course, we will stay on top of what happens with Palantir's earnings report to see what the stock does and how it reacts. And if some of these predictions might come true, Chris and I will continue to follow this. Chris, thank you so much for your time. Palantir investors out there watching this, let us know what you think in the comments. Do you have any other expectations leading into earnings? Are you still waiting for that deep pullback so you can add to your position? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments on Palantir. Thanks again for watching, everyone. As always, happy investing.